Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this event today. This event is part of a new series that I've created as part of my role with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. And I've called the series Artificial Intelligence because I hope that it will explore the very porous boundaries between machine realities and imaginations. As part of this series, I'm inviting leading researchers whose work I really admire and I find really exciting, who are working with critical questions about emerging technologies and their social impacts. And I'm stoked that the very first event today is with Dr. Massimo Airoldi. As we begin, I would like to show my respects and acknowledge the Bedigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which this event takes place, and acknowledge elders past and present. I'll introduce Massimo in a moment, but before we get started, I just wanted to share at least the first parts of a short story Massimo wrote a few years ago called Stealth Love. You can see the first extract, the first paragraph on the screen here. This was a story that I was so excited to have published in the fiction series of the Sociological review that I edit. And it's really made a mark on me, actually. I come back to this work all of the time. And I've written about it in journal articles, trying to think with some of the very creative ways that it marries scholarly concepts and literary metaphors that I just think is really rich and really elevates both the kind of literary techniques that I love when other people use and playing within my own work, and these great scholarly concepts that so many of us will be familiar with. So I'm going to read from the opening of Massimo's story before we dive into our in-conversation chat today. The story is called Stealth Love, and you can read the whole story on the Sociological Review's website. Aripiprazole bingo. Side effects: orthostatic hypertension and cardiac arrhythmia. Precisely what I need to fool the health tracking pillow kindly provided by our apprehensive HR colleagues and enjoy an unpredictable day trip on an otherwise hectic Monday morning. I close the bathroom cupboard, put my mum's old smartphone on the nightstand and kiss her sleepy forehead. I walk softly out of the door, down the steep stairs, and finally outside in the fresh daylight of Barons Court Road, London, anno 2022. Monday is tomorrow and I can tell it. Nobody is around. I stand in the middle of the street. As an architecture student or a painter, I can envision for a moment the regular imaginary lines of roofs and pavements converging at the vanishing focal point where my Uber is expected to appear within 2 or 3 minutes. Curtains protect the windows from the early afternoon sun, scenographic elements of an experimental theatre play whose performances stay backstage. Parked electric cars follow the perspective like glitter decorations in a sacred mosaic, carbon-free icons of a carbon-driven smart mobility. The old neighbourhood has changed, but my dusty mountain bike is still there, leaning against the wall of my family's row house among the tall yellow grass, indifferent to artificial intelligence and gentrification, apparently intact, incomprehensibly colourful, so 1990s. To me, teenage means freedom, not just for obvious biological or generational reasons. Back in the 1990s, one could skip school and have an ice cream in an amusement park with the sole magic power of a fake signature on paper. Now, things are slightly different. Both amusement parks and schools hide face recognition cameras. Bikes have GPS localizers. Every step we take, we are tracked by institutions and companies as taxpayers, workers, consumers, and last but not least, as partners. Soon after I met Anne for the first time 2 months and 1 day ago, unusual video recommendations made their appearance in Pornhub's homepage based on my brand new style of Google searching. The parabolic shoreline of Danang Beach, a half moon of light blue ocean facing a parallel stretch of photoshopped white sand and green palms, flashed in a 2x1 meter screen at a bus stop in Kensington High Street on a Saturday morning, yelling micro-targeted summer holidays I might be interested in. At first curious, my wife Lara swiftly became suspicious. No more compromising searches. I'll leave the story there and I'm going to pin Massimo. Massimo, I think your name says Watson because I've given you my link, but just so everybody knows, I've just pinned you at the top there. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we'll start our conversation.
Hi, so nice to see you. Thanks for the invitation and the fascinating reading. I was really
Oh, good. I'm so glad that you like to be opening with that. And it is so nice. Massimo and I, we have talked so many times over the past few years. And it's actually, this is the first time that we're meeting face to face. So we have an audience, but also it's so nice to do so in this format. The format for our discussion today is basically going to be Q&A. I have come up with a list of questions that I am interested in. But the session will be totally open for audience questions throughout and in a focused way towards the end of our hour. So please do feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. I'll specifically ask for questions with at about quarter to the hour. And you can freely unmute yourself and turn your video on if you'd like to ask questions. Just do know that the session is being recorded. So we'll put it up on the centre's YouTube page following the session so that other people can access it who couldn't be here in real time. As I said, I'm so thrilled to have Massimo here today for this first artificial intelligence event. Massimo is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Milan. His research interests include critical algorithm studies, computational methods, consumption, and cultural taste. And I have a great series of questions today about two of his texts in particular. The first is a new monograph that has just come out this year that is really excellent, called Machine Habitus Towards the Sociology of Algorithms. We'll start our conversation talking about the monograph because it's such a phenomenal achievement. And then we're going to tie in some discussion of the short story Massimo wrote that I read out the opening to just now. So Massimo, let me open with my first question. What is it that interests you about algorithms? In particular, where did this interest come from for you?
So thank you for the nice words and for having me here. It's a real pleasure. And yes, both the texts, both the book and the short story are quite about algorithms. So yes, I understand that. Of course, this interest is basically stemming from my early work on digital methods, my attempts to research basically society by repurposing like platforms, a sort of tools for studying the social world. So I was very fascinated by that, and I'm still very fascinated by that. And when I started my PhD with some colleagues, some friends, we thought, okay, we could actually study how music classifications are changing, our music consumption is changing with platforms by studying the network of recommendations on YouTube. The network of music recommendations. So we said, okay, let's map that. Let's see how the algorithm works, and let's try to study society using this kind of tool as a research tool. But the more I kind of started to dig into the algorithm of the related videos of YouTube. I started to read papers. I realized that it was quite an illusion to be able to simply map society through a tool that is nothing but neutral, and that it actively shapes basically the culture on the platform, the behavior of users. So I started to read a lot about the then emerging, it was like 2015, 2014. It was then emerging the first wave of literature, critical sociological and social science literature on algorithms. And I became more and more fascinated by that. And so I started also writing about this, and I was quite lucky to end up actually writing a book for Polity about that. So yes, I mean, it was a really, I mean, I've studied sociology. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a computer scientist, but I became curious the more I really approached the functioning of these systems, and also the sort of the parts of the story that are not very much told by computer scientists or marketers or platforms about that. So the fact that basically they don't just anticipate our desires and predict our needs, but they shape how we behave on platforms in ways that are tacit, are subtle, and ultimately aim to extract data and to keep us there. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, it 100% did. Yeah, there's such a great level of nuance in the book that I really liked, specifically on that I have found. I don't know, you just articulated it so well. Something that I really like about working in a center like this, that's really interdisciplinary, that has, you know, social scientists and designers, and we engage with artists, and there's legal scholars and computer scientists that kind of, yeah, it's such a really complicated system. And actually we do understand what is significant about those systems with slightly different ways. So no, I love, and of course this is a much more complicated idea in the book, but you summarize it so well that that the book really explores the culture in the code and the code in the culture. I love that as a tagline.
Thank you.
Okay. So my next question is why the focus on the feedback loop in particular? It's a super generative focus in the book, and is kind of especially the ways that you engage with Bourdieu to look at the feedback loop. So what is it that's sociologically interesting about this loop for you?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, of course, yes. Sociology doesn't use the notion of feedback loop that much, despite there are many sociologists influenced by cybernetics that are also much more competent than me with the ideas of cybernetics that emerged in the 50s, 40s, 50s with people like Norbert Wiener. Basically, my fascination for the idea of feedback loops started first with some of the articles, of the early articles about algorithms that were already these critical articles about algorithms, such as those by David Beard or Shani Lippold, others, that already started to kind of Ted Stripas started to talk about this kind of closed commercial loop by which algorithms process and information and shape also the environment where they act. And but the fact is that the more I read about that, and the more I got into cybernetics with the works of Wiener, the more I realized that actually the notion of feedback loop can be used really to explain a lot of things that we kind of take for granted in sociology. Meaning, the starting point was for me to describe a bit what I just mentioned, meaning the fact that algorithms do not simply learn from us. They don't just actually learn from our data and process our information, but they also shape how we act in the world. how we behave on platforms. So, for instance, the famous related videos algorithm of YouTube, which is my first my encounter with a close encounter with an algorithm, worked back in the days when I studied it, because now of course it has changed. It's more like based on deep learning. But back in 2015, their recommendations were basically based on a quite simple criterion, which was 2 videos are related if many people watch them in the same session, if they are co-viewed by many people, a collaborative filtering logic, as it's told. So basically the source of information was like information about how people viewed videos, right? About viewing patterns. But at the same time, I read other articles that say that about 70% of video views on YouTube depend on related videos. So the problem here is the related videos algorithm bases its functioning, its prediction on viewing patterns, but it's also the main source, the main driver of viewing patterns. This is a feedback loop. This is a feedback loop that has externalities that cannot be predicted a priori very much, despite, of course, the world of computer science of algorithms is all about prediction, but the sort of cultural consequence of the presence of myriads feedback loops like this one in our society all the time, not just in consumption, but also in the professional world. In many contexts, we are confronted with this mutual shaping between algorithms and users. And yes, I think this notion of feedback loop was very helpful for me to describe that, and also to link it to broader sociological questions that are there since more than a century, like what is the relation between individuals and social structure, between agents and society. I mean, because we make society from below, but we are made by society all the time. We are not just constrained, but we reproduce society with our action. And so what is that? Yes, in the book, I call it a sort of second order feedback loop. Society has always been recursive. Probably the recursivity that is an inner feature to some extent of the way in which algorithms are embedded in society can help also sociologists to see that better. I mean, to identify these patterns and to problematize them, as I try to do in the book, with a little help from Pierre Bourdieu, of course, who didn't speak about feedback loops, but I think again his work is very much about that, because that's what the relationship between the individual habitus and society is about. Is really this mutual shaping of mutual learning, mutual influence that is there, I think.
Yeah, as I said, I love your use of Bourdieu in the book, and yeah, it's funny that you said kind of your background of looking at music and the digitalization of music and algorithms, because yeah, some of the sociological work that I love best, and you shouted out Dave Beer, and there are a few other British sociologists whose work I really love on digital developments more broadly, that also engage with ideas like habitus, but come from this interest in changing music cultures. I think, yeah, it's such an interesting trajectory that gives such a nice texture to the kind of conceptual framing that you use. And yeah, I mean, I as hopefully is evident enough, I strongly recommend this as a read. I can't recommend it enough. Something else that I also love a book is the way that you use art as an example. I wasn't expecting this when I opened the book and kind of read through the introduction and how you return to it in the conclusion. What is it about the example that you open Machine Habitus with that's so evocative for you? Maybe talk us through through the example for those who haven't read the book, and then why you like that one so much.
Yes, thank you for asking about that. The example in question is called YACOS. Sort of the translation would be of this acronym would be Neighborhood Open Source Artificial Intelligence. It was an art project that was developed by, led by two wonderful human beings who are Salvatore Iaconesi and Oriana Persico. And unfortunately, Salvatore Iaconesi is not with us anymore. And he was a great thinker, great engineer, philosopher, artist, an amazing mind, and he was famous also for other artistic works that challenge, for instance, the black box character of health documents. I mean, basically, this work called the La Cura, The Cure was about that. So I do recommend everybody to look up the work of Salvatore Iaconesi. But in the book, I was particularly interested, and I thought it was a great example, I think, about the case of YACOS, because this system, this neighborhood artificial intelligence, was actually a simple sort of chatbot, basically a simple software with based on TensorFlow, based on neural networks, that was able to conversate, to talk with people and learn from what people say. And this system, differently from the AIs, from the machine learning systems we are used to, wasn't trained on sort of abstract data sets like Google News or Twitter or these like global big data sets. It was simply left as a sort of tabula rasa, without a specific, without a training that shaped its behavior, except for the data that came from the people of a specific neighborhood of Rome called Torpignattara, a multicultural neighborhood, quite disadvantaged neighborhood of the capital of Italy. And actually, it was very interesting that the project was really an artistic project, meaning you had they had this simple system. This simple system going around in the streets on a stroller with a tablet to be able to talk with actual people in the streets. And it was very interesting for me because it was an example that could allow me to say better, I think, and more clearly, that these systems are not just neutral technological systems, are not just artifacts. They are somehow socialized. This system didn't, by interacting with the people from that neighborhood, it didn't just learn how to talk generically, how to conversate, how to speak Italian or some other language. It learned that with the social connotation of that context, of that environment. It learned it with the nuances of that specific part of the world, of that specific social background of the people in that neighborhood, that is very different from the social background of people in another rich neighborhood of the city, for instance. And so this for me was very, I think, useful also for my own, let's say, not just as an example, but really as a way to think about this book and the idea of Machine Habitus, because I think it's an example of how really these machines, these machine learning systems, they don't learn just generic things. They learn from data that bear the imprint of the social world. And it's not just the neighborhood of Torpignattara that is a sort of physical, geographical context, but it's my Discover Weekly, it's my Spotify data that is, we know from Bourdieu, from the sociologists, they are not just unique, they are not personal, they reflect the specific, a specific position in the social world, a specific position in the social system. And I think that part of reasoning was really despite a very rich and interesting literature in critical algorithm studies, that sociological reflection was a little bit missing, because it was basically monopolized by the very important discussion about bias in AI. But I think that sociologically speaking, here, in the case of Yakos, for instance, it wasn't there weren't just the biases that might derive from being trained in that specific social context that interests me as a sociologist. Is more really the culture, really, the specific culture that enters the code, and which is a bit like, I mean, if we would be interested as sociologists just in bias, it's like if a sociologist would study only prejudices or stereotypes in humans. But we don't study just that, of course. We study much more futile things that explain culturally often human behavior. And I think the study of the role of machines in society really can benefit from a more cultural perspective that is able to go beyond the quite reductive notion of bias, and to see more in general how culture shapes the behavior, not just of humans, but also of these new kind of machines that are socialized to some extent, and that have these habitus, as I try to explain in the book.
That's a great lead actually to my next question, which is about reading practices. As you said, and I'm sure everybody listening is well familiar with, the landscape of literature around emerging technologies is massive and increased, like really growing at quite a rapid rate. And a lot of different disciplinary perspectives form part of this landscape. And it can at times be quite difficult both to find the kind of gaps, as you said, in looking at, say, computer studies literature that dominates through discussions and a strong focus on things like bias. There's also a lot of kind of different conceptual histories that we can bring to studying emerging technologies, and yeah, they definitely illuminate different parts of our relationship with these devices. Do you have any particular approaches to reading?
I mean, I've been reading about this topic since a while. I mean, meaning that I got fascinated about algorithms in 2015, and since then I try to stay quite updated on that topic. But you're right, the field is enormous, it's growing, and it's cannot be confined in specific disciplinary boundaries, and which means that, yes, especially at the beginning of before writing the book, I needed to read a lot of stuff. I mean, my Zotero is like huge. And of course, a lot of this stuff is, for instance, from computer science, which is a really different language and different field. So my practices were kind of, okay, let's really look at, on the one hand, specific journals that I knew were really about, that were writing a lot about these topics, especially in the social science. I mean, you have journals like New Media Society, Information Communication Society, but also International Journal of Cultural Studies, Theory, Culture and Society. You have many journals that have dedicated a lot of special issues, for instance, on this subject, and that was a bit my starting point. And of course, it was a bit of snowball kind of reading, meaning, okay, let's look at the references, and a bit of Google Scholar searching as everybody, because of course, also I relied inevitably on algorithms also to do my own work. So yeah, I tried to navigate this big field. Some books were very helpful too. I mean, the great work of Noble on algorithms of oppression, Virginia Eubanks, for instance, also on automating inequality. I can, and of course also the other great scholars, Katie O'Neill, you have many, especially female scholars that I would say were very helpful in framing these the social relevance of algorithms in a very clever way, and also to be able to explain something very hard to explain, which is machine learning, in simple terms. So all this knowledge was very useful, and fortunately I had myself a little bit of kind of technical competencies about algorithms myself after a while, because I did I used a little bit also myself machine learning classifiers to process big data, which is like my methodological passion, let's say, in the computational social science and more in general. And so, of course, I tried to put all these things together. I don't know if I was successful or not, but I tried to really map that. And also my students were very helpful, to be honest, because I had the privilege to teach about this topic since a long time. And when I was in, now I'm back to, I'm working in Italy at the University of Milan. As you said before, I lived in France for 4 years. I was working at the Milan Business School in Lyon, and I had the possibility to teach critical courses in a business school, which is already, let's say, a success, and also critical courses about platforms and algorithms, which maybe, I mean, I guided students in their group works, in their own researches, and this gave me a lot of interesting hints and stories and readings that were possible also thanks to the students, and of course also to the colleagues that I have, the amazing colleagues that I have now here, and I had at Lyon, that also were a very good source of for new references, new things to read. So it's yeah, I mean, it's complex. It's complex practice.
No, I love especially hearing about that. Yeah, that's incredibly generative research and teaching relationship.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was definitely successful. I think your efforts have definitely been successful, as is evident in the book. Before we talk about your fiction writing, I have one last question about the monograph. But from here on, my questions are about writing practices. So how did the book begin for you? How did Machine Habitus come together?
All right. So, you know, or now that I have been fascinating about algorithms since already many years, but in the meantime, basically my main job or between 2014 and 2017 was to do my PhD, basically to survive my PhD. And my PhD was about Bourdieu, of course, because that explains why I had the possibility to read a lot of works of Bourdieu. It was basically a study called digital distinction. I tried to map using YouTube data the practices of distinction by YouTube users in Italy. So that's why also the YouTube algorithm, that's why the computational methods, etc. But the interesting thing is that that gave me the possibility of, at the time, to read Bourdieu quite at length, at the level of depth that now with with the full-time academic job is hard to achieve, I think. And so that's the Bourdieu part of the story. And at the same time, I had this passion for the social implications of algorithms. I wanted to write a book about that since a while already, but I didn't know how to write it. The idea was, okay, let's see social structures and technostructures. So I wanted to write about basically how these systems contribute to reproduce society. So this idea of technosocial reproduction that I try now to describe, I try to describe in Machine Habitus in the book, but they didn't have a sort of a story, right? A way to put it in an incisive way. I was a bit confused, but And then at some point, I remember still one morning, I wake up like at 5 a.m. I don't know why. I would just wake up and started wandering in my bed. I was starting thinking, trying to sleep again, but I didn't succeed. And at some point, it was like an illumination, and I thought, okay, it's like a habitus. I mean, this culture that drives algorithms and machine learning systems is a bit like a habitus, because these systems don't have consciousness, don't understand really, they are not aware of what they're doing, of what they are classifying, of what's the meaning of a word. It's just a pure practical, as in Bourdieu's term, practical reproduction of patterns that still have a social source, a social origin that is culturally shaped and reflects a specific part, as I said, of the social world, a specific social class, a specific education, a specific ethnic origin, and whatever. And so I thought, okay, good. I mean, this could be a metaphor for talking about that. So basically, I wrote a book proposal. I sent it, and it was, to my great surprise, it was successful. And that, I think the fact that the editor of Polity is also translated some books of Pierre Bourdieu was helpful in the success of the proposal. So I think I was able to capture a bit like an interesting, let's say, to propose an interesting angle by mixing someone like Bourdieu that never spoke about technology, basically, with this very contemporary and a bit hype, let's say, topic. So basically, then I had a one year and a half to write the book. I signed the contract in September 2019. I spent like the first half of my time reading, and taking notes, and then at some point I realized that, okay, I need to start writing. If not, I will never meet the deadline. I was already thinking about excuses for procrastinating. But I must say, I'm a bit ashamed of the fact that the COVID lockdown in Europe was quite helpful in general, in allowing me to really focus almost full time on this crazy book, which means that in some moments, like before the deadline, I remember spending like 12 hours per day writing the final chapters. And then, I mean, yes, I had some corrections to make, of course, but the book was there, and it's been a relief then to see it out. I mean, I still don't believe, I cannot believe that it's there, and I can touch it with my hands on paper.
Well, let's go from your 5 a.m. waking dreams about Bourdieu to your incredibly evocative technological pillow and day trips of your short story, Stealth Love. How did this story come about? So it was published in 2019, but talk me through the writing process and where those creative ideas really came from for you.
Thank you. Also, thank you for trusting, I mean, my work and getting it out in that great place, which is the Sociological Review and the fiction section of the Sociological Review. And so I mean, this story came out. I always like to write, okay, in general, but I never tried really to write fiction in English. But at some point, I thought I was confident enough to try. And again, I was in that process of thinking about algorithms a lot, about platform society a lot with the students and in my research. And also I was really thinking about the sort of banal character of this platform surveillance, the fact that really we are already in a dystopia to some extent. simply we don't realize it probably very much. And also, I started thinking about, okay, these algorithms, of course, they process very personal information about people, very private information about people. And so they also threaten to expose this information. For instance, about a person cheating on his partner or her partner, or about some very private passions and opinions that are then manifested by the outputs of a personalized advertising on a platform, or a recommendation on Pornhub, for instance, as I mentioned in the book, in the story. And so I try to put these things together in this short story about this academic, this sociologist turned into marketing professor, which was also my role at the time, and that tries to meet again this woman, that he met briefly by chance in one of the rare moments where this techno-social order of 2028, London in 2028, which is now getting closer, one of the rare moments where like this order made of a full, let's say, a total control on what everybody is doing, from workers that have health tracking pillows that tell to the employees whether they can go to work or not, to drones in the streets that with face recognition cameras, and even bikes have GPS that is tracked by institutions, by companies. So it's a bit like a sort of is of course a dystopia, but that relies on some elements that are somehow already there. And this main character tries to escape this sort of algorithmic prison for one day, and tries to do whatever he can in order to, again, fool the health tracking pillows by taking the pills of his mother, his bedridden mother, that she is sick, and try to get again on track the old bike that he was using when he was a teenager, that one of the few remaining bikes without GPS tracker, trying to navigate the streets of London without a GPS. That is something anthropologically impossible to, and because of course in this context, in this imaginary society, nobody is able to do anything without algorithms, without a sort of automated recommendation or input. And it's also, as I write in the exegesis of the story, is also linked to the idea of algorithmic culture that Stripas, for instance, describe in his works. This idea that we are not just experiencing the fact that our behavior is shaped by automated recommendations, for instance, but it's our own broader, let's say, sort of, it's also biopolitical power, the one of algorithms and of prediction, or this culture of prediction that surrounds society and capitalism in particular, which is really, we are not anthropologically changed by the fact that we are so used to rely on these devices that we cannot basically do anything without them. And that's also one of the ideas of the story. And it's also this illusion of freedom to some extent that it is quite a pessimistic story, as you can tell. But it tries to, I mean, I was also reading about this, when I was writing the story, I was reading this article about this French jailbreaker, Redouane Faïd, and that was able apparently to, some of his partners were able to hijack an helicopter and let it land in the court of the prison in order to make him escape. And that happened in France, really. And for me, that was like a sort of metaphor of like, how is it possible to escape from here? I mean, you need to have a very complicated plan, and dangerous plan, in order to escape from a society that tracks you all the time and that expects you to behave in a specific way based on what you have done in the past. So it's also this path dependence, really, that is at the root of how algorithms work, and it's at the root of the interdependence between algorithms and humans that in the story, of course, is exaggerated, but it's not that, I think, that distant from what we are experiencing today, when we need to pick the right music for an evening, or to find your way into a city with Google Maps or Waze, or, I mean, we are already there in some ways. Hopefully it will not end in such a dystopian way in the next years, but yeah, we're already there, I think.
Yeah, as you say, the story is utopian, but it plays with possibility and chance, as you said, in a really exciting way, actually. That kind of, what I love about it is the ways that it puts into tension these dystopian and utopian ideas that we have about the promise of technology. I love how the helicopter story features in the short story. Yeah, in the conversation between the characters, and also the really amazingly done dream sequence. And something that I really love about that chance moment that you talk about. I encourage everybody to read the full story to get all the details. Summarizing it doesn't do it justice, but there's a beautiful moment in the story. It's very cleverly written, where the main character is out at lunch, and the internet goes down, basically, and it leads to this chance encounter that carries the rest of the story. And the way that you've written that scene, there's such an interesting way that you pace that scene. There's a really interesting pace to the way that you describe, that kind of, not as an individual frustration, but as a kind of, I don't know, like a significant in its collective experience, which I really like. So my next question is, and I'll take this moment to encourage everybody to think, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Massimo, and use this time now to put them in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll come to you after this. What is it that you enjoy about the form of fiction? Why do you write it? What is it about kind of the form of the genre of fiction that you like for doing this kind of thinking?
Thank you also for the I really appreciate the fact that you like that part of, and the story so much. And okay, why, yeah, let me also add something that I didn't mention in the previous question, which is I didn't use the word serendipity. I did, and I think that's crucial, meaning that chance, right, that space for chance is something that is even formally discussed in papers about the design of algorithmic systems. For instance, the problem with music recommendation is that you need to provide the user with some familiar content, but also there must be in some way some space for serendipity. So from there, and I think that the problem here is really that what is threatened by the algorithmic culture more in general is really this serendipity. It's really this possibility of deviating from a pre-established path and encounter something different, something which is basically life to some extent, one could say. But I don't want to sound too much nostalgic. I like technology myself, but of course, this on a side note. Regarding writing practices, okay, so I always love to read, and that's the reason why I also like to write when I was, especially when I was a teenager and when I was younger. I tried to write a little bit of fiction myself, and then of course I kind of stopped writing fiction because I needed to concentrate all my efforts in learning this specific literary genre that is academic writing. But I think that still the fiction is so, I mean, writing for a story, it's as a power, it's an evocative power that unfortunately the standard academic writing cannot have. And that's a defect that we have with art more in general, and with all the artistic forms that I think can carry, I mean, some ideas in a much more radical, in a much more effective way than in a sort of a standard academic or journalistic prose. So, of course, writing has always been very important to me, and also because I like a lot to read. I would like to have more time to read, but of course, that's why I try to myself to write a little bit. So that's it. And also writing, I think that the cool thing about writing fiction is that it always have also this sort of psychotherapy for free, meaning because you see, you can use it really as a tool to process your fears, your ideas, and to see them grow, develop in ways that otherwise would not be possible, I think. And so I'm saying just banal things because I'm not a professional writer, unfortunately. But yes, that's what it means to me. Is a very important practice, and I'm really sad that unfortunately is 99% monopolized by writing papers, but it's okay. That's life.
Well, I'm very, very much hoping that I can convince you to submit some more fiction to me, because I would love to publish it. It's really, it's a great story. It does such clever things. As I said at the start of the session, marrying literary metaphors and scholarly concepts in a way that I'm like now continually trying to figure out how to creatively bring into my own practice. Which I just love. We have a question in the chat from Michael Keane. Michael, I'll just read out your question. The algorithmic society can arguably be traced to a radical cultural movement. In the 60s and 70s, many younger people dropped out of the exploitative consumer capitalism of the day. Then some of them envisioned the freedom of the internet. Do you sense that we are now seeing a new cultural movement, dropouts from the algorithmic society because of its dystopian problems? Great question, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, it's a very good point. There's a big paradox of the internet, really, and of many technologies, digital technologies. The problem that has been emphasized by also some scholars that are more competent than me, for instance, on dropouts, for instance, people quitting platforms or disconnecting, is that since, as Bateson says, information is a difference that makes a difference. Even the fact that you're not there producing data is still an information to some extent, meaning that even disconnecting to some extent is produces some information that is valuable to the platform. And furthermore, I don't think that it's such a common, or I mean, we are all fear a lot of things. We live in very apocalyptic times, and but still one of the most reassuring habits is like scrolling your social media feed, meaning, and even if we might want to think of us as able to stop using them or to conduct a purely rural or different life out of technology, we rarely succeed in that, because the problem, I think, is also related to the fact that these tools have been designed also by probably some engineers that in the 70s and 80s were very libertarian and optimistic about the future. These systems have been designed to be very addictive, as the infinite scrolling design feature of platforms. They are more like slot machines than sort of information tools or social networks, which means that the problem, I think, here I'm going a little bit out of topic, but I think it's important to note here that I don't want to be a sort of ludist, or I don't want to say that technology is the problem here. The thing that I would like to try to point out also in the conclusion of the book is the problem is not technology. The problem is the culture that is embedded in technology, which in the case of algorithm, and the example of Yakos that I make in the beginning of the book is really, I think, witnesses that, because a machine learning system can be a tool to draw new relations in a community. It can be used, as it was in the case of Yakos, as a form of collective memory of the neighborhood that was able to kind of unite the different stories, the different sayings, the different imaginaries of people sharing a similar context with the same context with the same problems. So machine learning can be an amazing technology, and we see that also in many applications in health or in the sciences, etc. The problem is the fact that these tools are used really in ways that are, I think, not acceptable, that should be criticized more openly and more often. But we are a bit apathic about that. Like you just end up, okay, maybe I'll write that on Twitter, or yeah, I just scroll a little bit more and like some other content. I see another comment here from Michael. Maybe dropout is too radical term, but people are reducing their digital footprints somewhat. So yes, maybe, yeah. Despite, I mean, I think it's hard to, we should not reduce the traces that we produce and are processed by algorithms are not just the traces that we leave on social media. So, for instance, in the book, I speak a lot about digital platforms because, unfortunately, is the context that I know better. And recommendation systems are the type of machine learning algorithms that I know better. But the fact is that we produce data all the time. We produce the data every time we move in the streets with a smartphone without doing anything. We produce data anytime we enter a shop, potentially. The more these shops are equipped with new technologies tracking the movement of our eyes or whatever. Cameras are everywhere. So it's really hard to reduce your digital footprints because existing is already leaving a digital footprint nowadays. So we need eventually to think about how to imagine new ways really to not just to reduce your digital footprints probably, but to change and challenge the system, what it is done based on these digital footprints to some extent, which is currently either kind of controlling citizens or repressing revolutions or selling products in a sort of dying, a planet that is dying for climate change. So, I mean, yeah. Sorry for the not very optimistic start of. In my case, it's like 9 a.m. So it's not. It's gonna be a great day.
No, I think that's a perfect note to wrap up on. Very realistic, a very realistic examination of our relationship to technology with those important slivers of hope through art and storytelling and kind of meaningful community engagements. Everybody, please do thank me in joining. Please do join me in thanking Massimo for this great session today. You can use a little clap reaction. Yes, do feel free to turn your camera on and give us a wave as we log off. It's always nice to see people's faces who have joined us. Thank you so much for your time. You can find Machine Habitus by Polity Press, and you can read Massimo's short story Stealth Love, as I said, on the Sociological Review. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone. and we'll talk to you soon.